Thank you, Mr. President. I move to concur with a further amendment number 6522 to the message to accompany H.R. 7776, and I ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Alaska, Mr. Sullivan, moves to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 7776 with amendment numbered 6522.
Mr. President, I am really working hard with my colleagues here. I see Senator Durbin coming to the floor to make a law that we all know is the right thing to do. In fact, in my 8 years in the U.S. Senate, I don't think I've ever been involved with a matter that more desperately cries out for a just resolution to a simple issue. And it's this: do we, as the United States Senate, want to help sick United States Marines and their families, or do we want to allow a legislative bill that continues to further enrich trial lawyers in America? That's the question. That's the law I am working hard with many of my colleagues to make happen. And I think everyone knows the answer. Everyone in this body knows what the right thing to do is. Every American watching knows what the right thing to do is, and that is to help the brave Marine Corps heroes and their families who have sacrificed for decades to serve our nation. I've spoken to many of my colleagues, many of my Democratic colleagues in particular, and I know in their hearts that they also recognize we need to fix this problem. So what I'm asking my colleagues to do, particularly my Democratic friends, is this: help me fix it. Now, I want to say something. You're going to need a little courage, like the Marines that we're helping. You have a constituency that really does not like my legislation. The Trial Bar of America, we know they're very powerful. We know that most of my colleagues don't ever want to cross them, and they certainly don't want my bill to pass. But again, I ask my Democratic colleagues, have courage, do the right thing, work with me on fixing this problem. So, Mr. President, what's the problem? Well, I've spoken on the floor about this problem, usually in angry tones, because it burns me up. And any American watching who understands this, almost immediately it burns them up. And the Marines and their families, it burns them up as well. But to be honest, Mr. President, this afternoon I'm really down here more in terms of sadness and disappointment rather than anger. But I'm going to explain it once again. And if you're watching on TV or watching back at home, give a call to your senator and say, hey, fix this injustice. This is a real easy issue to fix. Here's the problem. We, a couple months ago, passed here the PACT Act, which was legislation to help military members who have been sickened by burn pits. This is an issue that I've been focused on my whole Senate career, starting with bipartisan legislation several years ago with Senator Manchin, Senator Klobuchar. So that was good, important, expensive but important. We got to take care of our veterans and our military. To me, that's the #1 priority we should be doing here in the Senate, which is why a provision of the PACT Act to provide compensation for Marines who were sickened by contaminated water at Camp LeJeune was also considered in the PACT Act. That was important. We should do that for these Marines and their families. Marines serving in the 1970s, 1980s at Camp LeJeune. So far, so good, Mr. President. That's what's happened. But as the legislation of the PACT Act and the Camp LeJeune Marines Compensation Act started to become clear, something reared its ugly head. And what reared its ugly head was the legislation was more of a gift to America's trial lawyers than it was to sick Marines. Now, we've all seen these ads. As a matter of fact, this morning on the radio, I heard a couple of them already. You can't go anywhere, turning on the TV, without a lawyer asking Marines to call to get them to help under this Camp LeJeune Compensation Act. Here we are. We've seen it. Everybody's seen it. We had a VA hearing about a month ago. I asked the VA, how much you think trial lawyers have been spending? This is a month ago. They estimated well over $1 billion a month ago. $1 billion. $1 billion. You think that $1 billion is going to go to sick Marines and their families? It's not. It's not, Mr. President. Now look, I don't blame the Marines who are dialing these 1-800 numbers. They're getting bombarded. If they're sick, they think this is the way that they're going to get cured and get their money. That's not the case, Mr. President. A lot of these are scams, and we know it. A lot of these are scams. The problem, Mr. President, right now is if a Marine calls one of these numbers, there is no limitation on what the trial lawyer representing the Marine can take out of the Marine's award. No limitation. No cap on contingency fees. No cap on anything. And here's the real problem. Everybody saw this problem coming. That as opposed to the Marines getting compensation for being sick, the trial lawyers of America would be enriched. Everybody saw it coming. And to their credit, the Biden administration saw it coming. So the Justice Department of the Biden administration had recommended in their technical assistance to us here in the Senate that there should be caps on these awards for trial lawyers. Makes sense. This is the Biden administration Justice Department, friends of many of these law firms. But they knew it was the right thing to do. They said 10% caps on contingency awards and 2% for filing fees. That was the Biden administration's recommendation. Now, Mr. President, that didn't happen. I won't go into all the bloody, gory details, but as we tried to amend the PACT Act, we wanted an amendment to do that. Biden administration did, the veteran service organizations did, because it was pretty simple. If there's a cap on fees for the lawyers, the Marines are going to get more. If there isn't, the trial lawyers are going to get more. We worked it hard, unfortunately, and sadly, really sadly, my Democratic colleagues blocked all those amendments when we tried to pass the PACT Act. So what's happened? What the Biden Justice Department predicted, what we all predicted, it's happening. Billions of dollars of ads, see them every day, hear them every day, every night, and Marines getting crumbs, trial attorneys getting rich. Mr. President, that's just not right. There's not one senator who knows that that is the right thing to do. This is an injustice right now in America. And already some Marines have lost money because of these scams. Some of these firms are promising big paydays. Of course, they're asking for money up front. A recent media story highlighted a Marine in Kentucky whose face was actually used in an ad claiming he had received a $35,000 settlement. In fact, he told a reporter he got 35 cents. Okay, that's not justice. So, of course, right now, Mr. President, the VA, local governments, veterans groups are frantically trying to warn Marines and their families, hey, don't listen to that. And Congress, please help us. There's reports that some law firms are charging 50 or 60% contingency fees. Are you kidding me? The veterans groups, the VA itself, the Biden administration VA, are crying out for help. Help. No more scams. Here's what the American Legion said at a recent meeting in a resolution they passed. Whereas predatory law firms charging exorbitant fees have engaged in aggressive marketing campaigns hurting veterans, the American Legion urges Congress to provide the necessary oversight for the implementation of the Camp LeJeune Justice Act to ensure veterans receive fair compensation. That's the American Legion. I'm a member. The VFW has also come out in support of what we're trying to do. So this should be simple. This should be simple. So what does my bill do? What does my amendment do, Mr. President? I'm going to explain it briefly here. The full name of my amendment, my bill, is the Protect Camp LeJeune Victims Ensnared by Trial Lawyers Scams Act, the VETS Act for short. And it's pretty simple, Mr. President. First of all, it just goes back to what the Biden administration had recommended in terms of a cap. Everybody here agrees there needs to be a cap on contingency fees. They had mentioned 10%, as I mentioned, on contingency fees, and 2% cap for filing the necessary paperwork. Now, my good friend, the senator from Illinois, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Senator Durbin, respectfully, I think he's going to speak and say, well, wait a minute. The normal fee is 33.5%, 1/3. Contingency fees. That's actually correct, but this isn't a normal fee. The reason the Biden administration had a low contingency fee at 10% is that the lawyers who are going to receive and help Marines get these benefits aren't going to go through big trials. They're not going to go through discovery. It's almost an administrative procedure process to check some boxes. The government doesn't even have a defense in this. So that's why 33.3%, the standard fare for contingency fees, has no place in this legislation. No place in this legislation. This is a government administrative process that's going to be made easy, supposedly, in the bill for Marines, sick Marines to recover compensation and their families. So when you hear talk about, no, it's got to be 1/3, that's just not true. The Biden administration recommended 10%. So don't be fooled by that, Mr. President. Americans watching, don't be fooled by that. So here's another thing. That's the key to my legislation. The other thing we're saying is because the compensation will come out of other benefits that the veterans receive from the VA, we make sure that the contingency fee is based on the net award, not the total award. And again, that's to serve the Marines and their families, not the trial lawyers. Let me give you one final thing my legislation does, Mr. President, and I don't think there's any senator who disagrees with this. And I'm pretty sure the chairman of the Judiciary Committee does not disagree with this. Somehow, when the VA implemented regulations on the implementation of this legislation, they issued a reg that makes sure the trial lawyers get paid before the sick Marines and their families. Say what? Yes, right now. Now that's crazy. Everybody, including lawyers, know that the client gets paid and then the client pays the lawyer. It shouldn't be the lawyer gets paid and then the client gets paid. That's crazy, especially if the client is a sick United States Marine. And I even think my colleague, Senator Durbin, agrees with that. So that's the other piece of this legislation. And Mr. President, We could fix that overnight by having the Secretary of the VA take a relook at that reg, saying, hey, that's wrong. Let's rescind that. I'd welcome if Secretary McDonough would do that. But, Mr. President, I'm going to keep fighting for this issue. This is an urgent issue. Payments under the Camp LeJeune Act will start early next year. The ads that we saw that I showed you here are likely to intensify over to the holidays to try to ensnare even more Marines into these schemes. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to withdraw my amendment. I am not going to force a vote on this amendment this afternoon because I want to get to a law. And I had a feeling that, unfortunately, my amendment was not going to get passed in this Senate on this vote this afternoon. So I want to work with Senator Durbin, Senator Blumenthal, other members on the other side of the aisle to do what we all know is the right thing, to pass a law that emphasizes what we all thought the bill was doing in the first place in the PACT Act, to take care of sick Marines and their families, not enrich trial lawyers. Again, I urge my colleagues to work with me. Like the U.S. Marines, have courage to stand up to powerful interest groups who are trying to take more money from individuals who deserve it. Work with me on this. It's the holiday season. Let's give the Marines and their families the gift that they deserve and have earned through courage and sacrifice, not the lump of coal and breadcrumbs, which is the result of this bill that dramatically focuses on enriching trial lawyers at the expense of U.S. Marines. I'm committed to work all weekend, all next week, but we need to get this done before we finish this Congress at the end of the year. Every American knows it. Every U.S. Senator knows it. It's the right thing to do, and I certainly hope my colleagues are going to work with me to make it happen. I yield the floor.